another minute, let another few people pop in. But hello, folks. Welcome to this next presentation of Beyond Addiction. Very, very happy you are here. As we get warmed up and people start to join us, why don't you just type in the chat where you are calling from? Let us know, give us a little sense of the geography. I think that we might even be an international group, and that's pretty great. We love the international crowd. Let's see. Are people able? Let me make sure that people are able. We had a couple of issues. Oh yeah, chat was
I
disabled.
think I just saw one roll in here, one response. Yep, here we go.
Everyone can chat with everybody now.
Chat disabled, I see.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, for pointing that out. All right. Where are you from? St. Louis, Knoxville, Berkeley, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, St. Louis,
Oh, nice.
Santa Barbara, St. Petersburg. We go down there. We have family in St. Petersburg. Maybe I like it down there. Bogota, cool. We are international.
Yeah. Very
Oaxaca, very
good.
good. Washington State. All right, very, very cool.
This is great.
Brooklyn.
We got people all over.
Yeah. And you're in Baltimore.
I'm in Baltimore, Maryland right now, although I have lived in San Jose and went to school in Palo Alto out there. So I have definitely some roots out in the Bay Area. And that's where you're at, right, Dan?
I left the Bay Area during the pandemic.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Yeah, I get that. I actually get that a lot.
Where are you at now?
I'm in far western Massachusetts. I'm about an hour west of, like Amherst and Northampton, all of that, just kind of in a little rural town that is super cute place to raise kids and just kind of get away from the grind a little bit. Of
Beautiful.
course, my grind has just become digital.
Well, I mean, I think for many of us, but
Yeah.
I mean, I love the New England area, so that's a cool place to be.
Yeah, it's good to have just kind of nature right out the door. That really kind of suits my constitution.
Absolutely. And yeah, it looks like though we do have a good contingent from the Bay Area, and welcome to folks from all over, and thanks for joining us. I talk a little bit today about psilocybin therapies for addiction, kind of loosely.
Would you
For
mind if I introduce you?
No, not at all, for addiction recovery. So I'll let Daniel introduce me first here. So.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Albert. All right. Uh, Albert Garcia Romeo, PhD, is an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. His research examines the effect of psychedelics in humans with a focus on psilocybin as an aid for the treatment of addiction. He earned his doctorate in psychology in 2012 from Sophia University in Palo Alto, where he studied self-transcendence, spiritual experiences, and the relationship to mental health. That's a whole other topic we should cover sometime. Dr. Garcia Romeo has authored numerous peer-reviewed articles, chapters, and commentaries on psychopharmacology and mental health, and has been interviewed widely in popular media. He is the Associate Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research. My first introduction to Dr. Albert's work was in 2012 when he spoke on psychedelics for smoking cessation at the conference we threw called Psychedemia.
I remember that meeting. That was one of the first meetings after I had finished grad school and worked, joined the team here. So
yeah, that was a good time. That was a pivotal moment, I think, for a lot of us.
yeah.
Anyway, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for organizing. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everybody that is joining us from all over, including places, further stream than even the US. So it's pretty cool to have a crowd here from multiple spots. And like I was saying, yeah, I'm mostly going to talk loosely about psilocybin therapies for addiction recovery. What, the history has been in this area, what the science looks like these days, which has been pretty robust and interesting. And we'll talk about some future directions in terms of what I am hoping will come down the pipeline. We don't really know for sure, of course. Um, but we're going to leave some time at the end for questions. And yeah, feel free to drop any in the chat too, and I'll try to keep an eye on that as we go along. But I have a bunch of slides, so I'm going to kind of cruise through some of these. And I'll start with disclosures. We always do these, but just basically says these are people that have given me money either to do work for them or to do research. So that's all transparent. But that's mostly companies like Otsuka and Science who are working on developing new medicines that are in the psychedelic space. And then also other groups have given me research funding, including the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health, but also a number of other like philanthropic and so on. But none of what I'm going to say today has got anything to do with what those funders had, in mind. So. I'll just talk really basic pharmacology stuff to get us started. There's a lot of different types of drugs, obviously, and we, can think of them as like uppers and downers, like stimulants and depressants. And these hallucinogens, though, are kind of really interesting. And I don't love that word, hallucinogens. I actually just published a nice short paper about this called Deconstructing the Trip Treatment. So if you're interested in reading that, it's like 2 or 3 pages, but really boils down a lot of this stuff. But hallucinogens means, it makes these people hallucinate, which is not 100% accurate, but there's a bunch of different kinds of hallucinogens that fall in that class. And that includes dissociative drugs like ketamine, which I won't talk too much about today, but I'll, touch briefly on, as well as what we call these classic psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca. And these drugs all share similar pharmacology. And so that's why we've grouped them together. But what's interesting is that a lot of these hallucinogens, including ketamine, including psilocybin, have what we think about as transdiagnostic treatment potentials, which means it's a medicine, but it's not just a medicine that you can use for one condition. It seems like it's a medicine you can use for a number of conditions. And of course, that includes things like depression and addictions or substance use disorders, as we call them now in psychiatry. Um, so, in terms of how these drugs work, these classic psychedelics in specific, we think a lot of what they're doing, really boils down to this serotonin 2A receptor, which you can see on this heat map is really kind of all over the cortex. And we don't really know what that serotonin 2A receptor is there for. Of course, serotonin is one of the many neurotransmitter systems in our brain. And there's about I think 14 different types of serotonin receptors. So they each do different things, but that seems to be really important for these classic psychedelics, which includes drugs like psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, and DMT, which is also obviously found in ayahuasca. But if you look at these, specifically these three, you can really see the clear similarity between serotonin, which your body makes and is already in your brain, and these other drugs like psilocybin and DMT. And so, uh, as a result, these work really substantially on our serotonin system. Psilocybin in particular has been studied for a pretty long time. Really, people have been using it for much longer than we've been studying it. And so I'll talk a bit about the history. But, from what we know about it, it's found in about 200 different species of mushrooms. Just like our brains make serotonin, these mushrooms make psilocybin. And most of the mushrooms that make psilocybin are in the genus Psilocybe. And so it seems as though people have been aware of this for a very long time. And so you can find things like these mushroom stones here, which are from Mayan ruins in Guatemala. And these are about 3,000 years old. So obviously, people have been trying and experimenting with these mushrooms for a very long time. Um, and what we know in terms of like our Western history is that about the 1520s, this fellow here, his name is Bernardino de Sahagún. He was a Franciscan friar who traveled over from Europe to the Americas, and he encountered these Aztecs and Mayans and all these other indigenous people. And really, he spent his entire life documenting what these people were doing and how they lived their lives, which I thought was quite fascinating. But in his work, one of the major works called the Florentine Codex, he specifically wrote that these Aztec people were taking these mushrooms, and that they seemed to be intoxicating and to cause visions, and that they would use them at ceremonies that would last all night long, where people would dance and sing and weep and sit in a meditative mood. And then when the effects wore off, that they would talk about the visions. So this is some of the first time in our Western history that non-indigenous people encounter psilocybin mushrooms and document it. So we know about this, going back to the 1500s. But in terms of like science proper and really understanding what is the molecule psilocybin and how does it work, that really didn't start until relatively recently. And it was specifically in 1955 when you see this guy here who went down he was a mushroom enthusiast. So not just psychedelic mushrooms, but he was interested in mycology generally. And so he went around to try to study different types of mushrooms. And he had heard about some interesting ones in the north of Mexico. So he went down to Huautla, where he encountered this lady here, Maria Sabina. So Sabina is a Mazatec healer. So she's indigenous to that region in the north of Mexico, where they do use these psilocybin containing mushrooms as part of their culture. And she introduced Wasson to the mushrooms. She brought him some. She explained to him, what they did, and they held a ceremony where he experienced this firsthand. He found it quite remarkable. He wrote a story about it in Life magazine, which was in 1957 published. And that was really the beginning of Western culture's sort of interest and fascination with these mushrooms. Um, Wasson took some of those mushrooms and he brought them back to this guy here. This is Albert Hoffman, who first discovered LSD back in the 1930s. So he was already a pretty famous chemist in this space. But Hoffman took the mushrooms that Wasson brought back from Sabina. He tried to figure out what the active ingredient was, and he figured out that indeed it was psilocybin. And so the first time we knew what psilocybin was, from a Western scientific standpoint, was in the 1950s. And that was, specifically due to, this interaction with these indigenous people who had kind of brought them to Wasson's attention. So before I go any further in the history, we kind of go from people who look like this, who are indigenous, and then to people who look like this, who are Western scientists who are working with these. And so I like to just sort of take a minute to zoom out briefly and say, a lot of what I'll talk about today is really kind of in this circle of the Venn diagram, this therapeutic medical model. That's where I work, School of Medicine, and we try to develop and study psychedelic therapies. But, there's a very long history, as we just, discussed, of spiritual and traditional use among different indigenous cultures, not just with psilocybin containing mushrooms, but also peyote and ayahuasca. So people have been using psychedelics outside of science for a very long time. And so I think we should respect that and also acknowledge that they have a lot of wisdom and understanding of these substances that we may not possess, coming from this newer therapeutic medical framework. And of course, there's also been a very long history of recreational use and exploratory use among a lot of different people. And, I think all of these different approaches have their place. We can learn something from all of them. And just, it's important that if you're working with these as medicines, then that you're clear about that. Or if you're working with them in a spiritual lineage, that you're clear about that. But, just having an appreciation for these various approaches, I think is useful to provide context for what we'll be talking about today. So coming back, like I said, I'll stay mostly within my little circle here, because that's really where I've been focused the last 13 years. But going back to the history of this stuff, it was really around this time in the middle of the 1950s that psychedelics started to take off. And it was people like Humphrey Osmond, who was the scientist and the doctor who was studying LSD. and who also was the first to coin the term psychedelic. So until that year in 1957, most everybody called these drugs either hallucinogens, like I've mentioned, or actually at that time, more commonly, these were referred to as psychotomimetics. And what that means is specifically that people thought these drugs made you psychotic just for a little while, until they wore off. But that was the medical framework to understand these drugs, was that they were inducing a psychosis. Osmond, who was working with these and also self-experimenting with them, including at mescaline and LSD, didn't really feel that that was an accurate terminology. And so he and Aldous Huxley, who you see here, who's a British author, they have both been taking these drugs and marveling at their effects and trying to come up with a better name for them. And that dialogue specifically is where the word psychedelic came from, which was really from Osmond saying that he thought that they were uncovering things that were already in our minds. And so that is really where the word psychedelic comes from in the 1957 when he first published that. Um, so at that time, there was a lot of scientists interested in these drugs, specifically LSD, because when Hoffman first discovered it, the company they worked for, Sandoz, which was based in Switzerland, just started making it and sending it to scientists all over the world for free. So if you wanted to learn more about LSD or Delicid, as they called it, as a drug, they would just send you a vial and you could experiment with it, as a scientist or a medical doctor. And during that time, there was a lot of work done with LSD, specifically trying to develop models of psychedelic therapy. And there were a couple of models that sort of stood out. We talked about how people use these recreationally sometimes and how other people might use them in more sacramental or traditional ways. But in terms of scientists, they really kind of took a couple of different approaches. And I should say not just scientists, but also clinicians, basically people who worked in medicine and therapy. And so some people tried to use these as standalone medicines, meaning they would give them as a high dose sometimes to people and see what the drugs did. Other people, particularly in Europe, were working with what they called a psycholytic model. They thought that if they would do sort of Freudian psychotherapy, like lay down on a couch and talk to me about your mother, but they would give them a low dose of LSD first, that it would be ego loosening, or that it would lower their defense mechanisms, and that it would make it easier to do therapy. And that became popular, and it was something that was done and is still done in certain parts of Europe. People like Torsten Posse, who are still around and working in this area actively, are big proponents of this psycholytic model. Then there was also another school that emerged, mostly in North America. So people like Osmond, who we just talked about, but also like Stan Groff and Bill Richards, who were working here in North America, developed this sort of what we call peak psychotherapy, where they would use really high doses, and they would just use a few of those. And instead of doing a talk therapy during that, they would give people doses that were so high that really they couldn't really engage in a lot of meaningful, coherent discussion. But they thought that those experiences were important to create a breakthrough or some sort of a peak experience that could then lead to some transformation and changes that then could be managed in therapy afterwards, through integration. And so that's really the model that a lot of which we continue to use today in a lot of these studies here at Hopkins and elsewhere. Early on, this type of model using peak psychedelic therapy with very high doses seemed to show some promise. This is one of my favorite studies that was done here in Baltimore, but this was with 74 men who were incarcerated, all of whom had a history of heroin dependence. Heroin has been a problem around here for a long time, much earlier than the 90s even. And so at that time, all of these men were basically in jail for different types of drug-related offenses and were being released. And upon that, they were then asked if they wanted to join a research study where they may get a high dose of LSD. And 74 said yes. Half of them got a high dose of LSD when they were released as part of a psychedelic therapy program. They did stay in a halfway house while that was happening just to make sure that everything was safe and stable. which took about a month, month and a half. But then they were released into the community as normal, and they had to come back every week as part of their parole and also provide urinalysis to see if they've been using opioids again. The other group was just released. There is no halfway house. There's no psychotherapy of with LSD or nothing like that. And they just kind of went on their way. And this was what you consider the normal practice at the time. And what we're seeing here is like the proportion of people in each of these groups that were returning urine negative drug samples at any given time point after the release. So this is 3 months after the release, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months. And what you can see is that, of course, everybody is abstinent from opioids when they're leaving, incarceration because they weren't really able to access these reliably when they're incarcerated. But by the time they get out, 3 months later, only 30% were abstinent in this regular, control group. 6 months later, it's closer to about 10 to 15% are abstinent. At the end of a year, only 5% are still abstinent from opioids. So 95% of those folks ended up going back to using either heroin or some other type of opioid, unfortunately. In the group that got the single high dose LSD therapy, what you're seeing is that all the way through 12 months, there is a higher proportion and a significantly greater number of people, 40%, 30%, and even at the end, closer to about 30%, 25, 30% are still abstinent, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when your baseline is only 5% are staying sober up to a year later, that looks pretty good because you're having a significant benefit. So some of these early studies, though they were, problematic, they weren't done necessarily the way we would do them today. They were pretty promising. And there was a lot of research with LSD for alcoholism. And this is a nice paper that was done by Terry Krebs and Paul Johansson, where they took data from 6 clinical trials with LSD for alcoholism. And really, they kind of stacked where the people landed in terms of their improvements. And what they found was that overall, the people on the LSD side of the equation were about twice as likely to show improvements in their alcohol misuse compared to people who had some sort of control condition. Usually it was some non-psychedelic talk therapy or some other medicine. So a lot of this early work was promising, but it didn't necessarily, it wasn't necessarily considered conclusive at the time. And the reason was there was results that kind of showed all sorts of different types of effects. And I see some questions here. What was the dose? So for instance, I'll talk about that now. In this study, they used 800 micrograms of LSD, which is a really high dose, and much more than people would want to take for pretty much any reason. And they also happened to strap these people to a bed, and they didn't really provide much in the way of preparation or integration either. And what did they find? Well, they found that a third of their patients got better from alcoholism, but that was about the same as in the control groups. So they thought, well, this must not work very well. But of course, as we all know, set and setting is really important for this type of thing. And so people like Stan Groff and Walter Pankey and others who were working in this area at the time did their own studies, and they had a different protocol that's much more like what we do today, where people were provided with preparation. They were doing the dosing sessions not while strapped to a hospital bed, but in a comfortable setting. And then they did some aftercare, some integration. They found that over half of those people that got high dose LSD showed improvements versus only about a third of people in the low. Exactly, the intention set and setting piece was really important. And so, what they found here is that, yes, there could be some significant benefit if you administer this in the right way. And in this study, by the way, they used a little bit more of a friendly dose, 300 to 450 micrograms of LSD. Still a whopping high dose, but, it was manageable, and they didn't really have a lot of problems with that. Of course, there was a lot of experimentation with psychedelics outside of research settings during the 1960s in particular. And, we talk a lot about, yeah, it is a solid dose. The Summer of Love, which is 1967 in the Haight-Ashbury and San Francisco area. And of course, in Woodstock, 1969, we had a lot of this use happening outside the lab. And that led to a pretty significant political backlash Specifically during the Nixon era, we saw the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, and unfortunately, that made not just the psychedelics, but cannabis as well, were all of a sudden illegal drugs. And that happened not just here in the US, but internationally. So right around 1970, 1971, all of these drugs were made illegal, and it made it difficult to do research with them. And there was a lot of concerns that these might be doing more harm than good. So they kind of went back into the box, and there was not a lot of work with them for, I would say, a good 25 years. Um, for people who are interested in the history of the war on drugs, I think this is a neat book, and I think they turned it into a Netflix series too, called Chasing the Scream. So I recommend it. It's a fun read. But you know, what we've seen over the last 20 or so years is really, though, this sort of psychedelic renaissance, as we call it. And so since the 2000s, there's just been this kind of exponential growth in research with LSD, MDMA, and of course psilocybin. This has led to a lot of people in the popular media asking these types of questions like, do LSD and magic mushrooms have a place in medicine? Which may seem counterintuitive, considering that they were so long viewed as these, risky and dangerous drugs of abuse. But nevertheless, we've seen increasing signals in the science that really suggests that these drugs can indeed be therapeutic, and maybe even with a single dose can lead to long-lasting benefits. And so these are some of the studies that have been published in pretty high impact journals like JAMA. This was a study where one dose of psilocybin was given to people with severe major depression, where they either got the psilocybin or they got niacin, which is basically a B vitamin that was meant to serve as a comparator. So this placebo group shows little improvement here after their session with niacin, but obviously the group that got psilocybin is showing this big, dip in their depressive symptom scores, and these, improvements persist out to 43 days or basically 6 weeks post treatment. So this is very compelling data because if you can give a person a medicine on one day and they're still going to be feeling better 6 weeks later, then that's quite different than what we normally do to treat depression. And these types of results have been replicated multiple times in different studies, like this one done in Switzerland, or this one that is now the largest study that's been published so far with 233 patients, and also showing that although 1 milligram and 10 milligrams of psilocybin don't really seem to do all that much at the end of the day, in the long term, 25 milligrams, which is a relatively high dose, is going out to the 6 week mark, showing substantially greater improvements in depressive symptoms. So, this is the type of thing that we've been seeing over the last decade or so. And that has also encouraged people to do more work in this addiction recovery space. One of the folks that's been very active in this area, Dr. Michael Bogenschutz, he started this off small, which, in the early days of this research, we didn't have a lot of resources to do the work. And so we have to do small studies. And so one of the first studies to do this with psilocybin in the modern era was 10 patients. And they either got 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin and they got some talk therapy. And what Michael found was that for up to 9 months after those psilocybin doses, these people are showing significant reductions in their days that they're drinking and that their heavy drinking days, which is very promising. They've since followed up with a larger study sample. This was done in 95 patients at the New York University, where they either received a placebo with talk therapy or psilocybin with talk therapy. And what you're seeing is most people started off with about half of their days being heavy drinking days, which would be, I think, 4 or 5 drinks for women and 5 or 6 drinks for men in a day. And what you're seeing is that after people got the talk therapy and the placebo, this went down to about 20%, and it stayed down. So it looks like the talk therapy does help, but it looks like the group that got the psilocybin with the talk therapy is showing a lot greater, improvements in terms of the reductions in alcohol use. And so this really dips down pretty low after the treatment, and it stays lower throughout. So this suggests that while the talk therapy in itself can be helpful, especially in combination with psilocybin, this seems to be the case. The plot thickens. This is another study that was done, a smaller study, but by one of my colleagues, Natalie Reeser, and some of her group that were done over in Switzerland. And they took 37 patients and they tried a short psychotherapy protocol. I didn't mention it, but this one was a 12-week psychotherapy with 2 high doses of psilocybin going up to 40 milligrams. This was a 5-week psychotherapy, 125 milligram dose of psilocybin or placebo. And in this study, they didn't really see a significant difference, even though these bars kind of look similar. The groups that got psilocybin and the group that got the placebo didn't show a big difference in terms of their drinking after the treatment. So to me, that shows that, kind of going back to the earlier research, the set and setting and intention matter. And in this case, maybe more therapy may have been needed, and certainly higher doses might have been useful, but it's hard to tell for sure. Another good study that was just published, like literally about a month or two ago, this is from a group in France, and what they found was that when they took 30 people who either got 2 high doses of psilocybin or 2 low placebo-like doses of 1 milligram with their normal talk therapy, 3 months later, 55% of the group who got psilocybin was showing abstinence, whereas 11% of the group who got placebo or 1 milligram was showing abstinence. So obviously, this is much of a greater, much greater improvements in the high dose group. And it does show that perhaps, the number of doses matters as well, which we don't really know quite yet, how much is needed. So, how do these treatments work is one of the big questions that we get. And I often think about this, and this is from a paper by Michael Bogenschie's, but I tend to think about this as sort of 2 sides of a coin, with brain effects and biological stuff happening on one side, and at the same time, there's these psychological effects, which include things like mystical or unitive experiences or insights that people have that make them want to change their behavior. So we'll talk more about each side of the coin in turn briefly. One of the big areas in the field on the biological side to understand the brain-related effects of these drugs has really focused on plasticity over the last few years. David Olson and others have started using these terms like psychoplastogen or neuroplastogen to describe the type of effects that they've seen mostly in animals, which is that if you give an animal a dose of a psychedelic like psilocybin, LSD, or DMT, these, being one of our neurons with many projections coming off of it, like axons and dendrites, when you give a person, or I should say, an animal, a dose of one of these psychedelics, all of a sudden, when you look back at the brain, it has grown these new projections, specifically these new synapses, these new dendrites, which seems to show some plasticity is taking place even after exposure just once to these types of classic psychedelics. Other folks like Alex Kwan have continued to show this similar type of effect, increased spine density after psilocybin, not just like the day after, but up to a month afterwards. And this also goes along with changes in behavior, specifically changes like reductions in learned helplessness. Now, this is something that happens when you repeatedly shock an animal over and over again in a place. When you put them back in that place, in that cage, they're going to get freaked out because they know, gosh, this is an unsafe place to be. And so they kind of freeze. Well, when you give one of those animals psilocybin, they learn to unfreeze much more quickly. Like, oh yeah, I'm good. This is safe now. Whereas the animals that don't get the psilocybin tend to stay much more vigilant and probably like somewhat worried. I don't want to say they're anxious, but that's what their behavior entails. So, what we're seeing is that one dose of these drugs can lead to changes in behavior, as well as changes in the brain that are lasting not just, a few weeks, but in this case, in this most recent paper, they found that these new spines in the brain are still there 65 days after one dose of psilocybin, and they can measure them and count them. So you can see this is before there's any psilocybin administered, and this is 65 days later, where you've got all of a sudden all these new projections. And these new projections are inputs, which allow for more swift and efficacious information processing in the brain. And so we would think this would go along with better things like better learning and decision making. Other animal researchers like Gould Dolan have shown that these psychedelics also tend to open what they call critical learning periods. So the way that our brain works when we're younger tends to be much more geared towards taking in new information. And when we're older, it tends to be more like managing what's coming in because we already got like a pretty good scheme of what's going on around us. However, these various psychedelics seem to open up new windows where our brain starts to act perhaps more childlike in a way and being more open to new information. So this is, one of the mechanisms that we think might be leading to these improvements. We can't really measure plasticity this way, by looking at the neurons in people because it takes, literally cutting open the brain, which is what we can do with animals, but not people. But we can use other means of looking at um, what's going on inside the brain. And this is a really interesting study because this was a small study done at Yale where people with depression first, they got a dose of placebo, and then they got a dose of psilocybin. And they didn't know that. The scientists who did the study knew that. But basically, what happened when they got the placebo, they had like a little dip in their depression, as you can see here. But that was it, and that lasted for a couple of weeks. And then they came in for their second session where they didn't know what they were going to get, but they sure enough got psilocybin. And then you see this kind of more substantial dip in their depressive symptoms. Now, what they did in the meantime was the day before, the day after, and 2 weeks after each dosing session, they took EEGs, which is basically measuring the electrical activity that's happening in the brain. And what they found was that a day after placebo and 2 weeks after placebo, the electrical activity in the brain was the same in these people. So nothing happened, which makes sense. What they found a day after psilocybin was the brain still looked the same. The electrical activity wasn't doing anything differently. But weirdly, 2 weeks later, so the drug is gone, it's not in the system anymore. But you see, obviously, this red blob here. What that is an increase in theta activity, a specific type of brain activity that's happening 2 weeks after the psilocybin. And when you look at that as a predictor of improvements in depression, that change in theta power, so that increase in activity, was directly correlated with the depression improvements that people saw. And so this starts to give us an idea that perhaps there is some neuroplasticity happening in people. At least there are changes that are happening even after the drug is worn off. And that has been, continued to bear fruit in different types of studies like this one, where people were in an MRI scanner for 21 days in a row after either psilocybin or methylphenidate. And what we see is that for 21 days after psilocybin, the brain is acting quite differently. Whereas at 21 days after methylphenidate, things still look generally the same as they used to. So not a lot of change there. And so why these drugs are doing these types of long-lasting changes or how they're creating these, we don't really know, but we're starting to get a better sense of that as we do more research. Now, this is much more my side of the coin on the psychological effects since I'm a psychologist and not a neuroscientist. But, many people for a long time have thought that these altered states of consciousness that come along with these drugs are, really creating a lot of the impact that we're seeing. The big problem is that even though people like William James, who I just showed you, have talked about altered states in sort of our Western medical framework, we really don't have a good understanding of them. We think about things like sleeping and dreaming or being in a coma, as the sort of states of consciousness that we're familiar with in Western medicine and psychology. We don't have a good frame of reference for things like meditative states or psychedelic states. But it appears as though, to me, that these types of altered states can really be useful from a addiction recovery standpoint, and really for anybody who's trying to deal with very rigid patterns of thinking and behavior that can be dysfunctional. And so when you think about a person as these sort of layers of what they do and their behaviors and what they think and how they feel emotionally, and ultimately who they think about themselves as being, their sense of self-identity, we know that these drugs can really shake up these layers of thinking and emotion. And I think that when we wrap that in a good therapy, we can really help people make meaningful changes in their behavior and their sense of self-identity, and that can lead to some of these good outcomes that we've seen in some of these studies. Another area that has been of interest of late, and this is the same study in Yale that I mentioned, where people got the placebo first and then the psilocybin, is specifically not just about neuroplasticity, but what we call psychological flexibility. And in that study, what they found was after placebo, people's psychological flexibility and their mindfulness did not change after the placebo. But after they got psilocybin, their mindfulness increased, their psychological flexibility increased, and that increase again was directly correlated with their reductions in depression. So in some work that I've done with Matt Johnson and others here at Hopkins, we've tried to work with people who are tobacco smokers who are trying to quit. In this early study, we took 15 smokers, we gave them 2 or 3 high doses of psilocybin, and we did some talk therapy. And what you're seeing here is basically people blowing in a breathalyzer machine that can tell us that they smoked or not. And at the beginning of the study, obviously everyone's above this cutoff line because they're still smoking. 10 weeks after they got the psilocybin, most of them quit. 6 months later, most of them are still not smoking. 12 months later, even 2.5 years later, the majority of these people are not smoking. And so we do think we're able to use some of these psychedelics like psilocybin in meaningful ways when the brain is plastic and when there's an intention behind it, to make these significant behavioral changes. We recently completed a bigger study, which should be published, we hope, relatively soon. But briefly, in 82 people who were trying to quit smoking, they either got CBT with nicotine patches or CBT with 1 high dose of psilocybin. And we kept track of them for about a year. These are not the final data, since we have not published those yet, but here's just some of the preliminary results. The number of people who are abstinent 3, 6, and 12 months after psilocybin, or 3, 6, and 12 months after using nicotine patches, which is an FDA-approved treatment for smoking. Obviously, you can see that the group who got the psilocybin did better. Now, some of our early work suggested that the more mystical type effects that people have when they're on psilocybin predicts better results in the smoking cessation area. Specifically, these feelings of unity, this feeling of oneness or connection that people might have when they're on psilocybin, led to reduced craving to smoke afterwards. Similarly, the more meaningful they found the experience, the greater their confidence to quit smoking afterwards. And in terms of like, what do these experiences look like? When we asked our smokers to describe their experiences, just as a reminder, these are all people who came to quit smoking. They weren't trying to have some big religious experience at a retreat or something. Many of them said very similar things, like this idea that we are all one, the awareness that all is one, feelings of oneness with the universe, my body melting and becoming one with the universe. These were not things that we told them to tell us. These were things that they told us when we asked them, what do you remember the most from your experience in the study? And so to me, that really speaks to this idea that these psychedelic experiences are almost like a trauma in reverse. And in medicine and psychology, we have a really good model for trauma because we understand that a perfectly healthy, normal person can go through a horrible traumatic experience that would then lead to things like PTSD, hypervigilance, flashbacks, and ongoing symptoms that are debilitating to their mental health and quality of life. But we don't have a good model the other direction. And that seems to be what's happening here to me, based on the work that we've been doing, was specifically that people would have this psychedelic experience that lead to these feelings of oneness and unity that then go on to have these ongoing mental health benefits. And that has been the case, in a number of studies, like in our cancer patients. The more of these unitive effects people have on their session day, the greater the reductions afterwards in anxiety and depression. And even in this largest study published so far by Compass with people with depression, the more feelings of what they call oceanic boundlessness, but basically a feeling of unity, and the more emotional breakthrough that they have during their sessions, the more reductions they have in their depressive symptoms afterwards. I said I would touch briefly on ketamine, so I'll mention it briefly. Some studies have also shown that we can use ketamine similarly with, in combination with therapy, with just a limited number of infusions to help people quit other drugs like alcohol or cocaine. This is a cool study. It was done in New York by Elias Stockwar and colleagues. But what they did was just one dose of ketamine with some talk therapy. This was specifically mindfulness-based relapse prevention. And then these were in people that were cocaine dependent. At the end of the study, about 50% of them were abstinent from cocaine. The group that got a control, which was midazolam, which is a benzodiazepine, only 11% were abstinent. So, and in that study, the more of these unitive effects they had during their ketamine infusions, the greater the improvements they would have later in their cocaine use. So to wrap it up, future directions, there's so many other types of substance use disorders like cannabis dependence. We're doing a research study on that now. Opioid use disorder, we're working on that as well. Stimulants like methamphetamine and cocaine. People like Christopher and Peter Hendricks are doing studies on that. And we're working on some new work in people with gambling disorders, and not even recovery from drugs per se, but from behavioral addictions, that we do think we may have some traction with these psychedelic therapies. Um, we don't really know what the best type of therapies are. I do think that we get a lot of leverage using group treatments. So that's something that's probably going to come down the pipeline. And we still have to understand the mechanisms better. But there's all these other psychedelics we haven't studied very much, and I think have a lot of great potential, like ayahuasca, which I'll show you some data in a second, mescaline, 5-MeO-DMT. So we're moving towards that. And people have done some good work showing that ayahuasca, in principle, can be used to help people with substance use disorders, even in group settings that are much more like a ritual as opposed to a one-on-one therapy. I do think it's important to take into account the cultural context when we're working with some of these medicines or using indigenous practices. But again, that goes back to what I said early on, which is just having an appreciation for these various perspectives is really important when we're doing this work. So, ketamine's out there, but people don't often use it for addiction treatment. But psilocybin will likely, it's on its way towards approval, I think. So in a few years, it's likely that people will be able to go to clinics to get this type of treatment, which I think is very exciting. And I'll stop there to give us about 10, 15 minutes here to do some question and answer. And I'm putting my email up too in case people have questions that we don't get to today. But yes, Ibogaine definitely looks interesting. But yeah, does anybody have any thoughts or questions that we could address, about the presentation, or just more broad questions about the field? Happy to answer those.
I am wondering, one of the things I'm wondering is like longer term check-ins, right? There's like a certain amount of time that you check in with folks, but like has there been any thought to like kind of checking in years down the road or anything like that?
So there have only been 3 studies to my knowledge that have done that, beyond 12 years. We did one of those with our tobacco smokers,
Hmm.
and here's what we found. 2.5 years later, this was actually between 2 and 5 years, depending on the person.
Hmm.
But the average was 30 months after their quit day. We
Right.
found that 60% of our smokers in this small study were still abstinent. So that was really encouraging. Our group from Hopkins here published last week, I think, a 5-year follow-up from depression with psilocybin, finding that most of those people were still showing improvements, although I should say many of them had gotten on other medicines in the interim.
Right.
Nevertheless, they seem to be in a better place than when they started their study treatment. And then finally, Gabby Ajan-Legis has done a nice follow-up study about 4 years after therapy with psilocybin in cancer patients. And the people who were they were able to find and contact, most of them still showed improvements 4 years later. So we think that this can have long-lasting and durable effects. I think one of the big problems, Daniel, is that most of these studies, especially like if you're studying a new medicine, they only go so far. So they'll like study you for 6 months and then you're out the door. So
Yeah.
getting those data long term tends to be not typical, but I
Yeah.
agree that it's really valuable so we can understand what the long term course looks like.
Yeah. I mean, the anecdotal evidence, suggests. I was curious if there was data. And there, there's probably a good documentary in there too. People love those documentaries where you follow people through their life.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. Do you have any studies or information about psychedelics and food addiction and binge eating?
So nobody has really done that. Actually, somebody mentioned they were doing a study like that in Florida, but I haven't seen any results and I haven't heard like what the outcomes look like. Probably the closest that we've seen so far, there've been a couple of studies in anorexia nervosa. Now, not
Hmm.
exactly binge eating, but it's in a similar vein, in terms of eating disorders. So I suspect there could be some utility there, but I don't think anyone studied it systematically at this point.
Um, cool, thank you. Jennifer would like to know about the idea. How do you see the future of perhaps like psychedelic addiction centers opening up?
It's unclear because we don't really know how this is going to be rolled out. But my best guess is that there's going to be special training needed for doctors, therapists, and nurses, for instance, who want
Hmm.
to do this type of work. And then they will then be able to go and start their clinics on their own or work at a place like Hopkins or, some other university or hospital where they'll open up clinics where then people can go to get this type of treatment. That's my best guess, but I don't know for sure because FDA will have a lot to say about how that works.
Right.
There's a good question here I just want to highlight because it's a big one. Did they take microdoses of psilocybin in this study or full doses? All of the studies that I showed you today were high doses. The studies that have used microdoses so far have not really shown any real benefit. Um, Now, there haven't been very well controlled studies of microdosing. There was like a small one of people with ADHD, for instance, with LSD versus placebo microdosing. The placebo group did better. So I don't really know that we have good data to suggest microdosing does a lot, but there's a ton of anecdotes, so it's hard to say what's going on there until I think we see some bigger controlled studies. But
Right.
all of the studies I showed you today that show antidepressant effects or anti-addictive effects, those were studies where we use a high dose, usually in the range of 25 or 30 milligrams of psilocybin.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
I just
Uh,
want some milk.
I'll put on music a little later. Are there any studies that address fentanyl dependency?
We're working on it. So no, yeah, I mean, we have a study that we're doing here now, but it's still ongoing. And that's Sandeep Nayak, my colleague here, is doing that now.
Um, right on. Okay, so somebody wants to know if they think the long-term use of alcohol can blunt the effect of psilocybin, similar to SSRI blunting.
Yes. I mean, so we don't know that for sure, but this is super fascinating because most of the studies you'll see we use 25 milligrams, but in the of psilocybin specifically, but in the most recent psilocybin study that Michael Bogenschutz did, they had approval to go up to 40 milligrams. The reason is historically, if you go back to some of those early studies, those LSD researchers were like, We give 100 or 200 micrograms to somebody of LSD who's a healthy person that doesn't have any, substance use disorder, and they will respond like quite strongly to that. We give that same dose of 100, 200 micrograms to a person with like heavy, serious, and chronic alcohol use. Often they come back and say, I'm not really feeling a whole lot. And that's
Mhm.
why you saw doses like 300 and 450 micrograms being used, because even way back in the 1960s, it seems like chronic heavy substance use, whether it's alcohol, cannabis, or something else, may make us less sensitive to some of these psychedelic effects.
Very,
Um,
very cool. So as we close down, Albert, thank you so much for your time. Can you think of anything else you kind of want to leave us with?
Mostly I'm glad to see that there's so much interest and there's people here up from all over the different, different parts of the country and even other countries. I just say also, just keep your critical thinking hats on when you're looking at some of this stuff. I mean, because there are definitely a lot of misinformation in the space, and I present a lot about the good that these substances can do, which I think is really important. But they carry risks as well, and some people are harmed by them. And so we just want to, always sort of keep an eye on the balance here. And anybody that's selling, something that's too good to be true, you should be wary of that. But overall, I'm just really pleased to see that the field has grown so much in the last, 10, 15 years. And I'm excited to see where it goes in the future.
Right on. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you again. Al, is there any way, people can find you through John Hopkins? I suppose you're not hard to find. Oh, there's your contact email right there.
Yep, my email is right there at the bottom. So if you got a question that we didn't get to, feel free to shoot it over. And yeah, I mean, in general, I'll put the website here, which is where you can go to get any information from our research studies and so on, because there's a lot happening here. But I mean, we're just one of many labs, so
Right.
a lot going on all over the country and even in different parts of the world now.
Very, very excellent. All right. Well, thank you all. We're going to take a little break. We're going to be back in 15 minutes. We're going to talk about spiritual approaches to recovery and integration. And we've got yeah, some great programming for the rest of the day. And so we will see you there. Everybody just kind of open your heart chakras once more, send lots of love to Dr. Albert, and we will see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Daniel.